Hello, everybody. This is Linda and Tony Bartlett here again with the fourth in our series of video podcasts that we are calling Stories with Tony and Linda. In these, we are giving an overview of the Bethany core Bible study course, which is called 7 Stories. The book has 8 lesson cycles. The first one is an introductory cycle that explains our approach to reading and interpreting the Bible. And the following 7 cycles deal with the biblical text directly. So today we are discussing the fourth of the 8 cycles, which is the third of the biblical story cycles. And this one is called The Land and Its Loss. So Tony, in this lesson cycle, we talk about framed stories, of which the land, is the focus of this study, and later the temple are the examples. Can you explain what a frame story is?
Yes, so at this point in the study of the whole of the Bible, we introduce a term and a concept which is very helpful in trying to get a grasp of the way the Bible is constructed and the way we read it. And we use the literary critical term of a framed story. And the Bible has a framed story. It has always been understood as having a framed story. And good examples of such a thing are, for example, the 1001 Nights, in which the heroine Scheherazade is going to be executed by her husband the following morning, but he asks her to tell a story, and she's able to string it out. 1001 Nights, presumably,
with cliffhangers,
that leave the story unfinished, so the king wants to hear the next episode, and so that's the frame of 1001 Nights, which then results in all the stories.
And those are the stories within the story.
That's right.
Within the frame.
Another good example is the book of Job itself in the Bible. It begins with the heavenly court, and Satan appearing in the heavenly court, and God and Satan having a conversation about Job. And then after that, it opens up to the horrors that Job experiences, and then his complaints, and it ends up back at the end with the figure of God appearing and making a judgment. And so the whole thing is bookended with this trial between God and Satan, and then God making a decision at the end, and then the passion, should we say, the suffering of Job in the middle. So it's a very common literary device to construct a story within a story, or even in a movie, for example, you'd have a story within a story.
So what is the frame story, the main frame story of the Bible as a whole?
Well, that's the question. And in the past, we have understood from a Christian perspective that the frame story comes right at the beginning in the book of Genesis, and we mentioned that before about the fall, chapters 2 and 3 of Genesis, the events surrounding our first parents in the Garden of Eden, and how they disobeyed God's command and were expelled from the Garden of Eden, and everything then fits in to that framework, that even the story, and really especially the story of Jesus is kind of overcoming that huge deficit that resulted at the beginning in Genesis. But the approach we've taken, as you'll remember from our first lesson on the stories, is that the way to start is to be more historically grounded, and to start with Exodus as some kind of necessary event which shaped the whole mentality and the whole culture of the Bible. And we said that was the Exodus. And so once you start from there, everything then begins to fit in to that framework. The giving of the land to the Exodus, and then the giving of the land at the end of the Exodus, the point of the Exodus, they will get to the land, and in this land they will be able to practice God's law, and so be be worthy of this gift that God has given them. However, in the 6th century, we know that something terrible happened and the land was taken away. The land in the city of Jerusalem and its temple were taken from the people and they lost it. So that was like this catastrophic kind of break in the middle of the historical framework of the land. But then out of that results something truly marvelous, which is the most profound and influential books of the Bible are written precisely out of this experience. Jeremiah, Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, Ezekiel, and then by association, the book of Daniel. And not excluding the book of Deuteronomy and the Torah itself, ending with the book of Deuteronomy, all seem to be put together at this crucial period in the aftermath of the exile at the beginning of the 6th century, running through that 6th century through to the 5th century. That was this period of maximum composition, which gave us this wonderfully transformative story of the scriptures.
So we also use in the text the word shell story, kind of interchangeably with frame story. Can you say a little bit why we do that?
Yeah, I mean, we substitute shell story for frame story because it allows us to see that out of the breaking of the frame, something wonderfully new and more than the frame itself can emerge. So just like with an oyster shell, you prise open the oyster shell, you find the pearl within.
And so you no longer need the shell.
You no longer need the shell, or at least in that kind of metaphor. The pearl is the thing that's really to be treasured. And so the frame breaks and continues to break all the way through to Jesus, and then you get the pearl of this radically transformative relationship with Father God of nonviolence.
So the loss of the land is the occasion for something wonderfully new, and this becomes a way of understanding the whole history of the Bible, because it is to do with a frame that is broken or lost, as you say. So the first lesson focuses on the importance of the land in the history of the people, and how the book of Deuteronomy especially interprets the loss of the land and the exile as a punishment by God for Israel's unfaithfulness, and the importance of holding onto it after they return from exile. You mentioned that Deuteronomy is put together during and directly after the exile, so that their goal is that with that mindset that they do not want to have a repeat of the exile because of their sinfulness. And this Deuteronomic interpretation of the loss of the land because of sin becomes the dominant interpretation of the Bible. So can you speak a little bit more about this Deuteronomic worldview?
To do that, we need to focus a little bit on the history leading up to the book of Deuteronomy. But generally speaking, we know that if something bad happens, something very bad happens, the kind of default human reaction is to say, I'm being punished, or why am I being punished?
Yeah, why has God done this to me?
That's right. It's a kind of mimetic response. There's some kind of violence done to me has to be violence. It's done by somebody else. So that it's not unnatural that the biblical viewpoint, and as we say, and we continue to say, the Deuteronomic worldview understands the loss of the land violently. It's a violent event, and it's done as violence, as punitive violence. Now, to get to that, we need to look at the end of the 7th century, just before the events of the 6th century, when Babylon rises to power and then very quickly invades Judea and takes the people captive and destroys the city and the temple. about a score of years before that, 20, 30 years before that, there was a king in Israel called Josiah. And according to the narrative in 2 Kings, the 2nd Kings chapter 18, during his reign, a manuscript is found in the cupboards, in the archives of the temple, and they bring it out and they read it. And it turns out that this is a book of the law. And Josiah reads it, and he tears his clothes out of fear and anguish, saying, and I quote from chapter 22, "The wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book." So already towards the end of 2nd Kings, the events of the collapse of Israel, the collapse of Judea, and the invasion of Babylon are signaled by this thought, by this concept of the wrath of the Lord kindled against us because our ancestors did not obey the law. So there's already an interpretation being given at this point for the events that are going to unfold, the catastrophic events that are going to unfold.
And Deuteronomy was written after those events had taken place, and so, or at the time, at the time of those events, and so this explanation is written as a kind of a future prophecy almost of something that has already happened.
Well, I mean that would be a critical interpretation, biblical critical interpretation, but it makes a lot of sense that when these events are happening, maybe they're not fully understood. It's only in hindsight, and when the people are in exile and they settle down, as Jeremiah told them to do, in Babylon, and the priestly class are there, and the educated people are there, and they have the distance and perspective to begin to think about everything that's happened to them. And so it's not unnatural or improbable to assume that it's from that perspective that this understanding, this explanation or interpretation of events is written down and becomes kind of normative. And go ahead.
So this understanding of God's punishment becomes the dominant understanding within the Bible of its own history,
right?
Which we are calling the Deuteronomic worldview.
Right.
It's also the dominant perspective of the people when after they return to the land following the end of the exile. So, which books in the Bible have this Deuteronomic?
Well, first of all, just to ground and make very physical the sense that Deuteronomy has of punishment. Go to chapter 28.
Okay.
If that needs underlining or affirming for you, go to chapter 28 and read the list of curses that are going to be inflicted upon Israel,
including invasion and
exile, which is what happened. So there's many more curses than there are blessings for obeying the Lord, curses for disobeying it, and the curses are, of course, what's real, and concentrate people's minds. So that kind of lens by which history is understood is crystallized there in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy.
And the whole book of Deuteronomy has that perspective?
Has that overall perspective, and then what is known as the Deuteronomic histories, especially 1 and 2 Kings, are written from that perspective. Kings is always looking towards it's this train running along these tracks is going to crash, because the kings, apart from David and then Josiah, are universally bad.
Right.
So that's the core of Deuteronomic histories, but it also influences Judges and 1 and 2 Samuel. Although 1 and 2 Samuel is his own kind of document, but it's there as this theme that runs all the way through from the taking of the land in Joshua to its loss at the beginning of the 6th century under the succeeding king from Josiah.
And then also it impacts some of the books written on after the return,
Right.
like Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. They fall into that.
Yeah, Ezra and Nehemiah especially, they refer to the wrath of God, and they essentially want to clean up Israel's activity in terms of the Sabbath, keeping the Sabbath, and then marrying or intermarriage with non-Israelite stock, non-Judean stock, excluding the wives of the foreigners who are foreigners. So there's this shaping of both the prior narrative and then the subsequent experience of the people that the Deuteronomic worldview carries through. So it's very, very important.
So the exile, as you say, was a key moment that in the formation of the self-concept of Judaism as we understand it,
right?
At the time of Jesus, anyway.
Right. Yeah.
That sense of no more intermarrying with people outside of Judaism, so that purity comes to the fore. It also provoked a very different perspective. The exile didn't just provoke the Deuteronomic worldview, it had other expressions that we will look at in more detail later, like those found in 2nd Isaiah.
Yeah.
And also Genesis.
Deuteronomy, the marvelous thing, just interject, the marvelous thing about Deuteronomy is that at the same time as it has this reward punishment ethic, it still maintains in every instance this marvelous sense of relationship. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods but me. You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole strength. I mean, there is the sense of a permanent relationship, come what may. But its overall structure is this reward and punishment. So,
so at the time of Jesus, by the time of Jesus, you were saying that the Deuteronomic worldview of that reward and punishment, and also fear of retribution and a return to exile if they put a foot out of place, was dominant among all the different groups that surrounded Jesus and with which Jesus interacted. And we see that in the Gospels. So can you, first describe the character of these different groups? This is the second lesson in the cycle.
The second lesson in the cycle moves us forward in time, essentially to the 2nd century. So we go from the 6th century, the time of the exile, to the 2nd century before Christ. And it's, again, incidentally, and, as a sidebar, it's really useful for us to get into our heads that this is overall is historical narrative. It's about the nature of history. It's about what happens in history and about the kind of destiny of humanity, of the way we work as human beings, or how God wants us to work. So this document, the Bible, is extremely rooted in history. So when you get to the 2nd century, a new crisis hits the Jews, Judea, because by this time the northern kingdom is gone. So basically what you've left for Israel is Judea. And the crisis is the crisis of Hellenization. Hellenization refers to the Greeks, beginning with Alexander the Great in the 4th century, who conquered the known world with his kind of blitzkrieg campaign in 12 years. This beat everyone conclusively, and the only way he didn't carry all the way through to China was that his soldiers were exhausted. I mean, he just was this relentless imperial force. But he established the culture of the Greeks because Alexander himself was a pupil of Aristotle, who, of course, was a pupil of Plato. So he brought with him the overall Greek worldview and the Greek way of life, which included the gymnasium, the hippodrome, the theater, all those kind of material.
Emporium, is it?
Yeah, the material elements of the Greek world, which were very attractive to people. They were, and including the Jews. Many people in Jerusalem felt, and you can read this in the first and second book of the Maccabees, they felt that their Jewish way, their Jewish God was basically old hat, and they needed to go for something new, literally the Greek hat. And that was something that was fashionable at the time. So that's Hellenization, but as well as its cultural attraction, there was a king, a Greek Syrian king, or descendant of the Greek uh, generals of Alexander in Antioch, who was then ruling that area, and including Judea. And so he, at some point, sought to impose, not just encourage the attractiveness of the Greek way of life, but actually to impose it. So he instituted laws against the Torah, against circumcision, against the reading of the book, etc. And so, for the first time in history, really, at least in Western history, there was a religious war against the Jews. And this not unnaturally provoked a reaction, and there was rebellion on the part of a priest called Mattathias and his sons, who were come to be known as the Maccabees, and the books of the Maccabees are named after them. And that rebellion was very successful. But out of that kind of crucible of that period of the 2nd century, there arose these groups.
So, first of all, there were the descendants of, well, the Maccabees became the ruling elite in Judea following their successful rebellion. And there, down the line, their descendants were Herod and Herod Antipas. You know,
they inherited the Hasmonean, as it's known, that dynasty. They inherited that kingdom. They weren't pure Jews themselves, but they inherited that kingdom by marrying into them.
And they were corrupt, and they hand in hand with the Romans. So that they were the Sadducees. They were the people who oversaw and were the power behind the temple.
Well, and so you would have the Herodians in Galilee, and then in Jerusalem you'd have the Sadducees, who were the high priests, and they were appointees of the Romans. They had to be approved by the Romans, and they had to support Roman power. And they were collaborationists, because that's all they were. That's what they did. They had dynastic power. They inherited dynastic power, and that was expressed in and through the temple, and they kept control in Jerusalem.
And the Zealots were more in like the original Maccabees. They were the freedom fighters, the political take up arms against the Romans.
Yes, so that's another group. And their heyday was to come 30 years after Jesus' death, with the rebellion, the revolt against Rome that resulted in the Jewish-Roman War. And the Zealots were very, very important. They were primary force against Rome. But there's two other groups. So you have the Sadducees and the Zealots we've talked about, but there's two other groups which are actually more central, one especially, and that is the Pharisees. So at the time of the crisis of Antiochus Epiphanes, a number of faithful Jews in Jerusalem, rather than submit to the corruption and the abomination that was being practiced in Jerusalem, including a pagan altar erected in the temple, they took to flight to the wilderness. They and their families and their livestock went into the wilderness to get away from the impurity, and the corruption of Jerusalem. And it's not certain, but scholars generally trace the ancestry or the origins of the Pharisees to this group. what is different about the Pharisees is that they didn't displace themselves geographically, although some of them may have done, but they found a way of returning to life in normal society in the civil society of Jerusalem, with all its corruption, but instituting a host of minor rules that enabled them to draw a distance between themselves and the world around them. Literally, they created an exclusion zone of purity by their rules of washing of hands and body, what to do, how to eat, what to eat, all that kind of thing, which created literally a hedge around them
to protect them from even possibly infringing on the Ten Commandments.
That's right. So
incurring God's wrath. So if they have all these, they keep all these other rules as extra rules, then they're protected.
Yeah, and the thinking there is that this, if an original group fled to the wilderness where there's no culture, it's just a wilderness, and you bring your faithfulness to God there and you try to practice that there, and then you return to Jerusalem, but with the same mentality, what you're trying to do is avoid, or one of the key motivations is to avoid the wrath of God returning because of the corruption that you have become involved in. So if you separate yourself, you will no longer be possibly threatened by that divine violence that was interpreted as having occurred in the exile. And just to complete the picture, the other groups, so there's four groups we've looked at, the Zealots, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and then there's the Essenes. And the Essenes are a group known in Roman culture in Judea, who practiced the separation from the world around them and even practiced a form of celibacy. And they are identified with the community, or the remains, the physical remains of a community known as Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea. And if that's correct, you could see the distance or the extreme that people went to. It's a very inhospitable place, but they prefer to be there than to endure the corruption and meaning by that the breakdown of their own relationship with God, their sense of who God was in their lives. They'd rather go there than be in Jerusalem. The Pharisees made a compromise. They could go back to the city, they go back to normal life, but this kind of array of rules in their personal lives, in their behavior, allowed them to maintain that distance. So the argument is that the generative force that's going on here is double-sided. One is faithfulness, no doubt about it. As we said in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a sense of relationship, and it's always there. You can't take that away. And there's absolutely no desire to do that. But on the other hand, violence itself is also at play. There's this generative sense of God as punitive at a certain point, that he will come and exact retribution for the wickedness and injustice of people's lives. And the Pharisees wanted to put themselves on the good side of that by these rules. So that's the context in which Jesus appears, and we see it as all flowing from the Deuteronomic worldview, where God has this punitive, retributive, violent possibility to his behavior. And that's affected Christianity as well. That's part of Christianity, and as people say, it results in a Janus face God who has two faces. One is benevolent, and the other is wrathful.
Right, and so at the time of Jesus, you have those groups established in the land, and you have the subsequent invasion by the Romans, who are more brutal, more physically present than the Greeks even. And in the final lesson in the cycle, we look at Jesus's response to the loss of the land, which was not the Deuteronomic worldview. So it contrasted very much with this. So tell us about how Jesus saw or understood or approached the loss of the land.
Right. So as Linda just said, the stakes have grown even higher by the Roman invasion, which took place in the year 6 CE, after the death of Herod the Great. The Romans came to take personal control, direct control of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. Now, this was anathema. I mean, it was in addition to any kind of collusionist or collaborating Sadducees in the temple. This was the physical presence of the brutal, unclean, pagan empire of the Romans. So this would have increased enormously the sense of dislocation. And we've got to understand that this was a moment of huge crisis for Judaism, which resulted in the Jewish-Roman War, as I say, 35 years after Jesus died. So it cannot be underestimated that the tension and the crisis in the land at this time, provoked by the series of experiences culminating in the Roman invasion just shortly after Jesus' birth, when he was a boy. So Jesus arises, Jesus comes at this point of maximum stress, shall we say. And his approach is to almost draw the poison out of the whole. Well, it's not almost, it is. It's to draw the poison out of the whole system. One thing he does, which is hugely significant, is that he takes his headquarters, he makes his headquarters on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And we've normally understood that as just, well, you know, it's a pretty place. It's like he starts his ministry in a vacation spot, you know. Well, no, he's on the shore of the Sea of Galilee because it's the sea and it's not the land.
And it's also not the River Jordan.
And it's not the River Jordan, which is where John the Baptist was, which also had national associations. The Sea of Galilee is not mentioned in the Old Testament. So Jesus does something remarkably new, and he chooses fishermen, people who make their living on the sea. And he says, I'm going to make you fishermen of people, of men and women. And that's not just a pretty phrase. It means it's going to save people from these depths, this abyss of human violence into which the world has sunk. Because in the Jewish cultural worldview, the sea was the place of violent monsters. And we see in the book of Daniel how the empires, the four empires culminating in the Romans, all come out of the sea. So Jesus deliberately takes his stand on the sea, and we see it, literally takes his stand on the sea when he walks on the water. And we see it working out in terms of what I'm describing here, the connection between the sea and violence, when he calms the storm, and then directly afterwards, seamlessly, and it can't be by accident, coming out of Mark's gospel, he heals the Gerasene demoniac. That is somebody on the other side of the lake, in pagan, Hellenized territory, Romanized territory, and the individual who has the demons, Jesus asks him, or asks the demons, what is their name? And they say Legion. And that is unmistakably a clue as to the character of the demonic possession that the land and that area is experiencing at this time. And Jesus heals him. He expels those demons of violence, and he is fully healed. So Jesus starts in a different place. He does something else in respect of violence. And
so if his he's rejecting the Deuteronomic worldview, what does he put in its place? I mean, we looked at the Sermon on the Mount earlier. I mean, what is different about what Jesus is teaching from the Deuteronomic perspective worldview?
Right. So that's absolutely vital as well. Along with his practice is what he actually taught, and we know in the Sermon on the Mount, he says things like this. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, you can't find a phrase precisely saying you will love your enemy, you will love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But if you go to the beginning of chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, it tells that it orders the people to wipe out the inhabitants of the land, and that is hating your enemy. And, wiping them out. There's no division between outer and inner really in the Hebrew cultural worldview. So if you hate somebody, you're going to do them harm. And then he says, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. In other words, he is, in all this practice and teaching, he's revealing a God of nonviolence who is identically good, both to the evil and the good. There's not a punitive side and a benevolent side. He makes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So this is the character of God as Jesus is proclaiming God out of his own personal experience, because we then learn in other places of the Gospels, four Gospels, that the Father and I are one, that if you see me, you see the Father, which is from John's Gospel. So he's putting an end to that dual-sided God that results from generative violence.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense because we see, as I said at the beginning, we see, if something is done to us, it's very hard for us not to see it as the work of an enemy. An enemy has done this. But he says, no, God is not your enemy. Because you are to forgive your enemies because God does the same to Father.
And Jesus is noteworthy for not accepting purity boundaries. So tell us a little bit.
Well, that's part and parcel of it as well. I mean, he goes in the opposite direction from the Pharisees because he doesn't, I would say, suffer from the same kind of trauma of theological violence that perhaps they do.
So he eats and drinks with sinners,
with tax collectors,
prostitutes.
And he says they're going to enter into the kingdom of heaven before you do.
Because it's about the relationship.
Because they have responded to this invitation with their whole heart. If that is that's the possibility. Once the invitation is made freely to you as a sinner, you don't have to do X, Y, Z and then prove yourself worthy. No, just respond with your whole heart to this invitation, to the proclamation of the kingdom of God.
So that heartfelt response of compassion is what brings us close to God. It's not a mechanism of violence or of exclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So final question. Why is this particular cycle in the seven stories so important for us as Christians today?
Well, we've done two cycles before this, two stories from oppression to justice and from violence to forgiveness. And they satisfy us on a kind of like symbolic level. We understand what that means to make that transition of meaning from one thing to the other. But all the time, all this is rooted in real history. That's what we're saying. That's what this whole story and cycle is about. And we have to realize that we are part of this history. Mm-hmm. And that is what's so liberating for people who do this study. They realize that if I've seen God this way, it's because I'm a human being. And the Jews or the Jewish people at that time saw God in this way because they're human beings. and they've constructed God in that way, in that retributive, um, violent way. And so there's not a matter. It's not a matter of condemnation or exclusion and say, well, we're now all over again pure. We're not newly pure of the Deuteronomic worldview. We all have it in us, and we want to blame other people. We see, as we said earlier on, God is punishing us if something goes bad. Those reactions are always there.
It's like Rennie Shiraz says that we're sort of hardwired that way.
That's right.
To blame someone, look to someone to blame, and
that's right. I mean, the attribution of blame is one of the most fundamental characteristics of being human. But the point of the gospel, the point of this story is to locate us within that story, within that tradition, and say, yes, we can be set free from it. You can't be set free from something you don't know exists or you don't know that is oppressing you. But if we understand that retributive, wrathful point of view is something that goes with the territory of being human, and that the gospel sets us free from it, then we can be set free.
So Jesus does something very different. He shows a very different understanding of God. He does not operate on that generative power of violence, but he operates on a different generative principle, which is the forgiveness, compassion, and love, for which he gets crucified.
For which he will be crucified because he stands so far out of the order of things that they will just make him another scapegoat.
However,
the resurrection, which is crucial to the Gospels, proves him right.
Affirms and confirms the truth of his teaching.
And that's always been the character of the Gospel, that you can entrust yourself to nonviolence because God marvelously vindicates it, approves of it in the resurrection of Jesus, and as a promise for all humanity.
And as Christians, we have inherited that two-faced Janus version of God. The God that can be loving and good, and the God of love, but also has this ability to be wrathful and punitive
and terrible.
So
terrifying.
And so what we want to just finish this recording with a quote from Richard Rohr, who says, many Christians have to go through a time and an experience of atheism because the God we have been taught to believe in does not exist. So that's at heart what the 7 Stories Bible study course is doing, is taking apart that violent God that we've inherited and is that we're hardwired to so easily believe in, and replace it with the God that revealed by Jesus in the Gospels, of a compassionate, nonviolent, loving God who forgives and blesses us.
And yes, and the reason why we can take that apart, deconstruct it, is because Jesus did it first. I mean, that's the nature of the gospel. So thank you.
Thank you. And we'll see you again next time. And if you want to find out more, you can dive deeper into the studies themselves if you go to our YouTube channel, or you can read the book and go further into the material in the 7 Stories book. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thank you.